Good morning, Moray Rabotai. We are continuing on Shulchan Aruch Harachaim, Hilchot Tefillah, and Siman Sadi Aleph, and we're up to Seif Dalet that we started. Rather Seif Hey that we started. Lo ya'amod be'afundato velo b'rosh megulem velo b'raglayim megulim im derech ansha makom shlo ya'amdu lifnei hagdolim ela b'teraglayim. So a person should not go with things that are not considered proper attire with respect to tefillah, and much of this, as we explained last time, are subjective to the community you find yourself in, to the culture and the time that you live in, and based on what they had in the time of Shulchan Aruch, when you have a special folded belt that used to be designated for putting your business money and so on and so forth in, that's not considered necessarily a respectful attire for tefillah. So is standing with an uncovered head when you don't have proper kisui rosh, or your legs are not covered, you don't have shoes, perhaps if you live in a place that people do not stand with socks in front of a respectful person. So we mentioned that the Mishna Berura writes that nowadays you need to have a hat, a top hat, for davening. We mentioned that Sefer Ishei Israel brings this. This is others also bring it, but the one that really is more of a reliable source in the name of Reb Chaim Kanievsky is Sefer Ishei Israel, that the person should rather daven b'yachid with a black hat than with Sibur if he has missed his black hat, because the Ben Yeshiva should be davening with a black hat. How about Yosef writes that if you don't if you don't normally have your black hat, it's not a personal attire of yours, so then you don't have to daven with a black hat. If that's the normal way you appear in public, then you don't have to have it. The Chamenzer Rabbi Shaul, Rabbi Chaliyahu all say the same thing, and therefore you should not necessarily lose tefillah b'tzibur if that's not something that you're always very specific about. And the reason that Mishna Berura gives is you have to have kova berosho kederech sheolech barechov velo bekova akatan shtach kova, not with a kippah, not with a yarmulke that you have under your hat, because people go in the street in the time of the Ben Ish Chai, even in European culture, in the European cities, you would walk in the street with a top hat. So therefore, it would be considered, not formal attire to daven with a yarmulke. But nowadays, of course, outside the yeshiva world, it's not necessarily the minhag. You don't stand in front of important people without a hat. Now, how about even though that he is lenient, and the same with Rabbi Shaul, they say the kisui rosh, let's say different halacha altogether, the kisui rosh has to cover the majority of a person's head. It has to be a kisui that's bechaser rov harosh. So sometimes to have a hat, a top hat, is important because people's yarmulke sometimes starts from a bottle cap size to size 6, 7, and that's also not mechaser rov harosh. So you need to have that mindfulness as well. It's not just a matter of what you stand in front of chashuvim with, but it's also the halachot of what is considered kisui harosh that's proper for tefillah.
Even if it's very small, it doesn't. It's asur.
Again, meikaradin is not asur necessarily. With how that we mentioned before that having a kippah altogether is not an obligation, aside from Siman Sadi Aleph, our Siman, that you mentioning Hashem's name with it, or coming in the Bet Knesset, in regards to general halacha in Siman Bet. Well, you see from the Gemarot in Masechet Shabbat, Kuf Nun Vav, the Gemara in Kiddushin Chavted, and other places, that having a kippah was not necessarily for everyone. It's not an obligation. Nowadays, Chacham Ovadia writes that because this differentiates between frum and not frum people, that it is an obligation. But Medinat Gemara is not necessarily an obligation, unless, again, you want to mention Hashem's name. That's a different story. And for that, having a smaller kippah also would suffice, perhaps. But for lechatchila, certainly for tefillah, a person should have a kisui rosh that's mechaser rov harosh. Now,
sorry, the halacha, we discussed that it's asur lelet 400 b'li kippah. Is that a halacha or that chassidut?
so again, that's a machloket of achronim, how to reconcile Siman Bet Sif Vav with Siman Tzadi Aleph, because in one of them it says you should not be going. It doesn't say asur. The language of the Shulchan Aruch there is, see if I could catch this quickly. The language of Shulchan Aruch there is lo yelech. It doesn't say asur. I believe that's the language. Just to check it inside, the Shulchan Aruch over there says Velo yelech 400 begilu rosh, right? So there it says lo yelech. Over here it says there are those who say it's asur to go enter the shul or make azkarot of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name without things. So some achronim say the difference between here and there is also asur, but it's only 400. Over here, you can't even stay 1 second in the shul without the kippah. Others would say, well, there it says lo yelech, it's a hanaga. Over here is the isur. So again, you have the two different schools of achronim, how to understand put together two pieces of Shulchan Aruch from two. So the Taz writes over there, again, these are all things that we have discussed when we learned Siman Bet. Over there is a Taz that says under ceiling is less of an issue than under the sky. There were some of the poskim in the United States early on in the 40s and 50s and 60s that they would tell people, or the business owners or people who dealt with goyim, and it was very difficult to run a business or to be a lawyer or whatnot with keeping the yarmulke. So they would tell them, outside wear and inside you don't have to be, based on this, because of the effect that it would have on their business. I still remember I was speaking to a very prominent, influential lawyer, older individual, that whenever we stepped out, I thought he was not frum. But then I realized that he was very frum, actually. He was a learned person. And inside the building, he was without a kippah, not in a shul, of course. And before, every time it was makpid, he had like one of these straw hats. And whenever he was about to go out, he would put it on. So I asked him, he asked one of the early on poskim in the European poskim who were in America in the 50s and 60s. And he paskin for him that he could be mekel, or when he's with the goyim in his business, under the ceiling to be somech on this. But again, nowadays things have changed very much, and the general minhag is like Chacham Ovadia says that even if you're under the ceiling, you would be machmir, because this is the differentiating factor between the good. But if chas v'shalom, if it would be in a place of sakana or a place that he actually could seriously affect, I think there are those poskim who are mekel under the ceiling when it's not tachat kippah hashemayim. So says the
exposure of the smaller kippah under the hat. Is it?
Second.
I see some they always have their kippah under the hat exposed somewhat in the back. Is it?
No, they're just trying to fit their hat on, perhaps. So says the Mishna Berura. Again, we left this in the middle. The Chorshken Shlof Mitz. If you have those head covering that are made for sleeping, that's not respectful attire for davening. Imagine one of those sleeping hats that you have. That's not, it's a cover of head. Yeah, it is a cover, but it has to be also a proper attire for tefillah, and it's not. En להתפלל בבקש שקיים של פשטן לבד, דגנאי הוא לעמוד כלפני גדולים. If you have, linen socks, and that's the only thing you're wearing on your feet, says the Mishnah Berura, that's not bekavod to stand in daven. Again, we mentioned this before, that many of the Sephardi countries, they would enter the shul taking off the shoes beforehand, and perhaps coming from the two places in Tanakh, by Moshe Rabbeinu shal na'alcha me'araglecha, by Yeshua shal na'alcha me'araglecha, ki hamakom asher ata omed atmat kodeshu. And the Muslims have certainly adopted this minhag. Now it's hard to know if we took this from them at some point in time, or they took it from us, but the source of it is by us in Tanakh. And if you have a minhag like that, fine, good. But if you don't have a minhag like that, when you have moved already to the Western culture, can a person daven just with socks? That becomes a little questionable. And Chafetz Chaim over here is writing that if you have only batei shukayim shel pishtan, that's already disrespectful, because nobody would stand with that in front of gedolim. It's not considered a respectable attire. You also should not wear gloves in the time of tefillah. Again, this became very nogea in East Coast when the minyanim were outside, especially outdoors for COVID. People's freezing cold. You want to know if you could wear. The Ben Ish Chai writes daven with gloves is disrespectful, right? But again, if it's known that everyone is freezing, and you're wearing it not because you are very sensitive and you don't want to hold the sidur with your bare hands, but just because your hands are going to fall off if you don't have batei yadayim, so then it's of course a different thing altogether. But not in a time of cold in that way. Just a person that wants to, fancy person that wants to hold everything with gloves and so on, they should be mindful. Now, I had a person yesterday that they actually taking OT. They had a third-degree burn with hot oil that burnt half of one of their hands. So not a pretty thing at all. And it's going to take about a year until it's very embarrassing for them to. It's a woman. Very embarrassing for them to go in public with that type of burn on their entire hand up to here. So I want to know if they want one of those gloves that women wear and go to shul with that and daven. Yeah, again, even though the Ben Ish Chai says over here that normally speaking would be not a proper thing. Again, she's not doing it because she is a sensitive person. She's doing it because it's very embarrassing for her, for people to see the amount of burn that she has on her hand, and it doesn't look pretty. So therefore, it's going to also probably attract a lot of much more attention, and take away from the people's mindset and kavanah. So again, hakol lefi ha'inyan. These are, personal questions that the person should ask, but in general, it's considered, it says the Ben Ish Chai, disrespectful when a person davens with having gloves on, and that's a Od Yosef Chai in Parashat Mishpatim. The Ben Ish Chai says it over there. Finishing up the Mishnah Berura over here. V'koreh ani alehem al tevo'ani regel gava v'yad resha'im al tenideni. The Bach writes that this is a pasuk that says this is regel gava. If a person wears that type of socks or gloves, yad resha'im al tenideni, he calls it, this is a very negative thing. U'mechaya adam dileel mashma afilu batei shokayim shel tzemer levad gam ken en nachon. Even if it's more fancy and it's batei shokayim shel tzemer, the wool ones are more fine-tuned and more beautiful, still is not proper to daven. Chai Adam seems to say, "V'akol talui lefi minhag bekomot." Everything of this halacha depends on the minhag of the place and culture that you find yourself and the time you find yourself in. And says the Maramins, he made the takana in his community that you cannot enter the shul b'ne'alim arukim, I mean, if you have the boots that are tall and come up all the way on a person's leg, that he was metaken that he should not daven with those. But if the derech is to daven like that, then it's mutar. You know, many years ago I went to New Square. The New Square Hasidim, they all wear boots because the previous Rebbe wore boots. So as a mindset of Hasidim usually has it, they follow the things that the Rebbe does in order to consider themselves attached to him in different ways. However you think of that, in halachic view, once it becomes the minhag, like 1,000 families that are in New Square, all of them daven like that, all of them walk around like that, so then that's not disrespectful. It's nice, shiny, beautiful boots, even though that the rest of the world would only wear that when it's snowed 2 feet. They wouldn't necessarily wear it in a regular attire, and it would be considered kind of like disrespectful. But that place, and in these times, that's how they dress. That's fine. Again, Chacham Ovadia writes in the kibbutzniks in Eretz Yisrael, for them to daven in shorts, it's fine, because that's how they will appear in front of the prime minister as well. It's not considered disrespectful. That's just how they dress. Even though that for the rest of the world would be very disrespectful to stand in tefillah in shorts. Why are you doing? Like, you wouldn't go in the White House or to a office meeting even with shorts, short pants. But in Eretz Yisrael they do. That's the minhag. So therefore, Chacham Ovadia writes that for them would be fine.
They used to go do wedding in sandals.
Again, that would be the same thing. Can you daven with flip flops? No. But again, if you live in that culture, then perhaps it would be permissible. So it says the Mishnah Berura in Ot Yud Gimel, Mihu im habeged aroch shechofe et haraglayim. If you have long dress or long coat that comes down all the way to the ankles, all the way to the raglayim, and it covers your feet, then even though that it's not covered under this cover, it will be fine. Or in, let's say, if you go to Africa, places that people don't wear shoes because you can't wear shoes. It's just too hot. And you'll be boiling in your shoes and in your boots. So people wear nothing in Africa, or they wear flip-flops. They wear open sandals, right? So in those countries that even in front of Gidolim you stand like that, then it's fine. Then it will be halachically fine. Now, Maran writes in next sif, in Sivav, final sif of the Siman Sadi Aleph, Derech hachachamim v'talmidehem shelo yitpalelu ela shehem atufim. Chachamim v'talmidehem, talmidei chachamim, they daven when they are atufim, when they are covered. The Rama adds, ube'et zam yesh tchabek hayadayim b'shat tefillah. This is a tour bringing it from the Gemara, that in the time that things are difficult, in the time of tefillah, they would hug their hands, so to speak, like an eved in front of his master. Ube'et shalom, and things are all fine, yesh leitkashet b'begadim na'im leitpalel, then you daven with beautiful clothing, with a happy mode clothing, and that's also straight from the Gemara. Says the Mishnah Berura, there's no Mishnah Berura over here, and this sif, so that brings us to the next Siman. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Hayat tzarich, this is Siman Tzadi Bet, Sif Aleph, Hayat tzarich linkavav al yitpalel v'mitalel tefilato toeva. So this is an important sif in Shulchan Aruch. A person that needs to use the facilities, can he daven or can he not daven? Well, the question is a broad question, and it really depends whether or not he could control himself, hold himself for a certain period of time. L'chatchila, he should not daven. Even if he could hold himself for 72 minutes, still, l'chatchila, a person that needs to go to the restroom, he should stop davening and go to use the bathroom. But the evet, if he davens, is that tefillah going to be considered the proper tefillah, or is it to'eva and he should go and daven again one more time? So sometimes that would be the case, that if you didn't stop and you continued davening, your tefillah did not count, and you have to go back and daven again. So the Shulchan Aruch over here starts, and this is again straight from the Gemara in Masechet Brachot Daf Chaf Gimel. The Gemara there says that if you needed to use the facilities and you davened, nevertheless, your tefillah is to'eva. It's abomination. It's not a proper tefillah. You have to daven again. Now, the Mishnah Berura writes, the reason for this, as the Gemara says, is the pasuk in Amos that we had. Hikon likrat Elokecha Yisrael. You should prepare yourself when you go to greet Hashem. And this is not preparing. What kind of preparation it is that you can't even hold yourself, you need the bathroom. Shemor raglecha kasher telech el beit ha'elokim. And Chazal say, from that pasuk in Masechet Brachot Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph, Shemor raglecha means Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shemor nekavecha b'sha'ah she'ata omed b'tfilah lefanai. You should check yourself that you don't need to use the bathroom when you stand in front of me in tefillah. And a person that does not keep this halakha because he doesn't know it, the Pelei Yoetz writes, Rabbi Eliezer Popo, the Turkish Gadol and Gaon and Hasid, in Sefer Pelei Yoetz, he writes, even a person that didn't know is going to be punished, because how dare you not know? You have to learn Torah, you have to learn halakha. People, especially from people, they suffice by the lowest common denominator. You're Shomer Shabbat, you go to shul, you walk the walk and talk the talk, and the commitment to knowing the entire halakha, finishing Shulchan Aruch, knowing all the halachot. We just started here Seder to go through the entire Kisur Shulchan Aruch at least. You have Rabbanim who have never finished Shulchan Aruch. How is that possible? It's lack of commitment to knowing. It says the Pelei Yoetz, too bad. You have the obligation of being committed to knowing the halachot. So it's not an excuse that, I didn't know the halacha. So therefore, even if he doesn't know the halacha, it's going to be subject to the same consequence, because you should have known better. Maran Chida writes that in the Rashi Tevot of the pasuk, you have this concept hinted. We say Hikon likrat Elokecha Yisrael. The Rashi Tevot is Hanitzrach, right? So that's the Hanitzrach likavav al yitpalel. Hanitzrach likavav al yitpalel is Hey Lamed Aleph Yud is Hikon likrat Elokecha Yisrael. The same exact order. Hikon likrat Elokecha Yisrael, says Maran Chida, it's Rashi Tevot Hanisrach lenikavav al yitpalel, that if you need the bathroom, you should not be davening. And this is again the writings of Maran Chida in Moreh Be'etzba, is a sefer that I've mentioned many times. Every Jew should really buy it and read it cover to cover. A very short sefer, but filled with Yirat Shamayim, filled with basic halachot, daily halachot that the person needs to know. Sefer Moreh Be'etzba of Maran Chida is something very important to go through. You could easily go through it in few months. If you spend 2 minutes after tefillah to just read a few lines of it, and it's guaranteed to have Yirat Shamayim. A person that reads through this sefer, a tremendous sefer, a must read by everyone. So over there, Maran Chida writes the pasuk that we darshin is really the Rashi Tevot of this halacha, Hanitzrach lenikavav al yitpalel. So it says Moreh Be'etzba. I could send it to you afterwards. So it says the Ben Ish Chai, one more piece over here. The Ben Ish Chai writes that according to Kabbalah, a person should be very mindful and careful to use the bathroom immediately when he feels the need for it. So he gives an example. He says, imagine if you're in the middle of a Daf Zohar, his example, or you're in Daf Gemara you're learning, right? I said, well, let me finish this daf and then I'll go. That's foolish. Immediately when you need to go, you stop, you go, use the bathroom, because again, Al Pi Kabbalah holds the psolet that's ready to go out and so on. A person should not keep that tum'ah on himself because the psolet contains tum'ah, and you're keeping the tum'ah on yourself. That's not a proper thing to do. It's not a proper decision. He writes this in halachot. He also writes this in the hakdama to his halachot of Ben Ish Chai in Parashat Vayetze. He says that the person should be very careful to not wait even a moment extra when he needs to use the facility. So no, same of Amidah, we're going to discuss that. We haven't gotten there yet. That's a good question, very good question. Because again, this is when you can easily go, stop and go, and not necessarily in the middle of Amidah. We are still in the middle of the halacha. We'll, Be'ezrat Hashem, continue this seif in the days to come.